fresh life in Russia. And now we're talking about the year 1991. After 5 years at university, I emerged with a degree. Congratulations. I'd been too busy and interested to be depressed, and thank God that particular trouble had disappeared along the way.
Yes.
So it's like, I was thinking about this. Maybe you can touch on it a little bit in terms of when we experience depression, which I think everybody has at some point.
Yes.
You find something you love.
Well, exactly. This, of course, is what got me out of it. I found something I was interested in that I loved, and I gave myself to it, and in so doing, just simply forgot to be depressed. It is actually a very useful approach to no end of conditions that bother you, mental conditions as well as outward ones, but perhaps particularly mental conditions. And it's the way, it's how meditation works. It simply introduces into your mind something that's preferable to this incessant thinking. But of course, a lot of people love their thinking. A lot of people love their depression, love their suffering, it's strange to say. But you probably throw things at me for saying that. But if you really are honest and look at yourself, a lot of people absolutely wallow in self-pity and misery. Well, I did. I know only too well the feeling, still do sometimes. And what on earth gets us out of it? Well, there's no easy answer, but if you find something you really love and are interested in, more than me, then it's easy. It just pulls you out, doesn't it? Then you forget. You forget to be depressed. You forget about me. Problem solved.
That verse that's worth remembering about you cannot understand Russia. Do you mind reading that to us?
Yes, I will, with pleasure. It's the most important little verse. It was written by a man called Tyutchev, one of the great Russian poets. He was actually living in France for much of his life. But if anything sums up Russia vis-a-vis the Western way of looking at things, it's worth absorbing what it says. You cannot understand Russia with the intellect. You cannot measure her by ordinary standards. She has her own particular and special ways. In her, you can only believe. Well, that goes right back to what we were talking about, I think, in our last session, about the head and the heart. Whereas the West is predominantly heady, having faith in man and the answers of man to the world's situation. Russia works with the heart. And this is at the root of much of misunderstanding. You cannot understand Russia with the intellect. You can't reason with it. You can't say, why doesn't she follow us? Why isn't she like us? Why doesn't she think like us? And as I learned more and more about Russia, I realized how this necessity to have what, if you understand French, is called an objet d'amour. It's an object of love. Well, normally you think of a woman who fulfills that role in a man's life, or vice versa, a man or woman who feels this way. But it can also influence the way of government that you want. You see, you want this is why Russia has always had a sort of first First of all, of course, is God, to love God. And Russian religion is very much a love-orientated expression, but through best part of a century of communism, you see, God had been abolished. You even mentioned the word at your peril. You would be you'd be either sent off to Siberia or even executed for confessing your faith, and the countless millions of people were. There's never been such a martyrdom in the history of the world as Russia went through in the early days of the revolution. But you see, this necessity to love means that Russians always look up, if not God, then whoever stands in God's place. Well, through the communist years, this was a man called Lenin, the communist God. Lenin became like a second Jesus. Jesus was abolished, so Lenin took his place, and was, of course, propagated like this. So Russia has always willingly embraced a father figure at the top of that as when you get a good one, many of the Tsars were very good men, some of them were not. Well, that's just the luck of the draw, as it were, but loving whoever was there in the picture on the wall representing the father figure of the nation, you see. And so this makes you a willing servant, a willing slave, even. You see, you do what you're told because this is what love does. Love wishes to serve, not for me. Love wishes to give yourself in service to the beloved. You see, this lies at the very root of the Russian character. Yes, and this, of course, is why Western government is just not like the West. It's a unjudgmental acceptance of higher authority. Now, of course, I told you there's this great division in society between the Westernizers, of course, who don't go down this road, or the great majority of ordinary people who do, and who are very willing to do so. And this love, you see, gives such a nobility to the simple, ordinary Russian people. It raises them up. You see, there's no human quality more noble than humility. It's in self-sacrifice that the true nobility of the human soul becomes evident. Now, there's a different way of looking at nobility, isn't it? It's not really to do with having a big estate and having a title. If you want to see true nobility, my friends, go and study the faces of the old women sweeping the streets in Russia, or kneeling on, bowing their heads to the floor in a Russian church. You'll see something that, well, maybe if you're hard-hearted enough, you won't respond, but I did. It just melted my heart, and I wanted to be there with them on the floor. A great, great lesson. There's no quality more esteemed in Russia than humility. No, that wouldn't go down very well in a Western society, would it? Political debate. Yes, you see, communism was secular. It was godless. In fact, many people described it as antichrist. You see, man put himself in the place of God. It was a product, actually. Communism was thought out by Marx and Engels, one or two other people. Actually, they worked in the British Museum in London, and then it was exported to Russia. It was not a Russian production, and on this wave of Westernizers, the early revolutionaries, believing in the power of the human intellect, you see that this became imposed by the most brutal imaginable means on the more or less passive Russian population. I could talk forever on this, but very few people in the West, unfortunately, really understand much of the history of Russia. The absolutely cataclysmic upheavals of society that followed this Russian Revolution completely turned traditional Russian society upside down and tried to bring them up to what was called a modern world. Well, of course, the repercussions of that rumble on to this day. But I was there as communism was just breaking up, in the process of breaking up. It had really outlived its time, and this was so striking to me because they built the most enormous structures. I'd never, ever, anywhere in the world seen such colossal architecture as the communists put up. Absolutely stupendous constructions, and then the whole sort of whole economic social order that lay behind that began to crack at the seams, and proved it wasn't as sound as it appeared to be. And so there was this heartbreaking sense of disillusionment that all that effort, the countless millions of lives sacrificed for this great ideal, this great social ideal of socialism, that's what it was, socialism plus communism. And you see it, well, you began to see its flaws, and when people think of, well, this we gave our lives for this, we lived by. My father, my grandfather was sacrificed for this. Think of all the millions that died for the sake of this social revolution. What for? Now it's all broken down. And what's left? What do we live for now? And that was how from sort of deep in the archives and buried under the floorboards and from here and there in the memories of the old people, there were some fragments of the old faith, the Christian faith began to emerge. And for the first time in 3 generations, it became possible to actually talk about this openly without the police knocking at your door. And even, my God, I remember the very first old lady sitting in the streets with a little stall selling, the early literature that was printed about faith. Goodness me, when you haven't been allowed to mention the Bible or Jesus for 80 years, when it's suddenly allowed, it doesn't half mean something. And people began to rediscover it. My God, this is what they deprived of us. How could they have done this? How could they have just cut this out of our lives, out of our children's education? So we never knew it existed. We only had this communism. Yes, my dears, that's what I came up against. I can never forget how just outside the little town where I lived, there was an old village church. It was a very Russian village with little wooden houses, all very traditional, cows and that. And there was a little church which had been, it wasn't one of the first to be taken over by the communists. It happened quite late on, actually. But nevertheless, it had been ransacked, and it had been used as a storage place. I think on a farm. I'm not sure that animals had been in there. Anyway, it was all sort of neglected and broken, but people were just beginning to clean it up a bit. There was no furniture, of course, at all. No icons, nothing on the walls, but just a bare concrete floor. But people were starting to meet there and read again. That somebody had saved or discovered a few of the old books, and these, of course, were being reprinted again, so people could read the old prayers. And people were starting to discover them. But If you learn these prayers as children, it's one thing. If you're trying to learn them in your 50s and 60s and even older, it's something very different. But people did, and they began to discover something bigger than man. My God, something bigger than man. Yes, and 99% of Russian churches were either destroyed, converted into cinemas or dance halls or just storage places, warehouses, garages, anything. Just imagine wherever you're living and you're listening to this video, think of all the churches you know, and then just take 99% of them, turn them into what I'm talking about. Countless millions of people were martyred for their faith. Priests were exterminated as a race. Priests were sent to extermination camps. Monks and nuns were pretty much exterminated likewise. Extraordinary, just imagine it. And of course, the children were brought up for 3 generations with no knowledge. Extraordinary. How could that happen? You know, Lenin, this character who was the sort of god of communism, he had a famous phrase. He said, "Religion is the opium of the people. It's the drug of the people." To a certain degree, was right, because the old Russia was very much orientated on religion. At its worst, it can become like a drug, excuse for many things. But of course, that's not the whole story, is it? Religion is the opium of the people. Well, what's the opium of the people now? some man-made political idea. Then tried to impose socialism. That became the opium of the people for a long time. I think after a long experience of that, people preferred religion of the 2 opiums, which is the worst. So there you are, dear. That's history. That's what happens in this extraordinary procedure of human life.
I've heard you say this before, but you touch on it where you write, the more I experience life, the less certain I am about anything. And for me, the Russian scene, more than most others, defies analysis.
Well, you see, it does. And that little poem that I read you at the beginning hits the nail on the head. You see, you can't reason it out. You won't make sense of it. And historians who try to, write from that point of view will miss the point. It's an emotional process, you see. And love, as I've said before, love is blind, and love will throw itself into the most crazy situations if that's where love leads. I know myself. Love will jump off the precipice, my dear. Never think of a life belt. Jump off into the ocean of love in adoration. So you get revolutions and you get revolutionaries saying, waving the flag, whoa, we're going to do this, that and the other, pull down the old order. Love, my dear, it's all love, crazy, crazy love. Love's a sort of madness, isn't it, when it gets like that? And you have to laugh sometimes, don't you? Oh dear, love will die for love. The glory of love will said it'll die for the beloved. It'll die for the ideal. An ideal, you see, and I'm an idealist. I never died for it, but I would have done. I jolly nearly have. I've certainly jumped off quite a number of precipices in my life. And crazy. But to see, if you come through, you reach the heights. And those of you that know anything of Russian culture, their music, their ballet, their literature, their art, you know that there's nothing like Russian art that has that wonderful heart quality in it that just brings tears to your eyes. Countless people have have slaved away by candlelight, producing these great works, and not a mention of who they were or are. They gave themselves in devotion to the work and lie in an unknown grave. And that's their nobility, isn't it? That's the greatness, because it's not the greatness of me, it's the greatness of God. That's what comes through it, you see. It's the individual is what gets in the way. The me is what gets in the way. And this is what brings society down from nobility to, that is worse, this sort of crass egoism that pervades so much of the world today. Selfishness rules supreme, doesn't it? I've told you, think how many times our conversation is ruled by I, me, and mine. These are the advertisements of the ego. Every time we say I, me, or mine, you are standing on a pedestal and saying, look at this separate individual that matters, the ego. In a way, you can say we're advertising our foolishness in the eyes of God. Well, that's a bold thing to say. Perhaps I should take that back. But in the eyes of a better alternative, let's put it like that. Yes, how do we deal with it? We first have to see it, see where it leads.
On page 132, you write about your mother who died in 1992. I love the sentence here. You write, in spirit, things are not as they appear from earth. But I thought maybe you would like to share a little bit more about your mother.
I only realized when I went to Russia and began to uncover something of what I'm talking about, that I realized how very Russian mother was. Like me, she never really fitted. She loved England. She never ceased to be grateful to England for giving her a home. I told you she was sent out of Russia in her late teens as a refugee child, having said goodbye to her family. His mother's life was my sister on one or two occasions would, on one occasion particularly teased mother, saying, which one of us did she love most? And mother replied, saying she would cut herself in 3 pieces, one for my sister, one for my father, and one for me. That was her life and her attitude. Total self-sacrifice. I don't think I ever in my whole life heard mother say, I want. I don't think she ever went out shopping for herself, bought herself any presents. Dad was very generous, looked after her very well, but she'd never do it for herself. During the war and the early years of our lives, she made her own clothes, made her children's clothes. My early clothes were all handmade by her. Very modesty, quiet spoken, loved her home. That character I told you about, the little wooden house, this hominess of the Russian character, the security of the little house, that was very much mother. Especially when we moved to our second house, an old stone house up here in the north of England. She lived, I think she felt safe there within the thick stone walls of this house. She never did what, people call going out. She never made close friends among English people. For some time, Dad had a little house in France, and Mum made friends more easily with French people. French are more, at least halfway in character between the British and the Russians. They have a more emotive temperament, more open character that Mother could respond to. So she, in a sense, led a lonely life. Dad was the outgoing one. But I wouldn't say she was unhappy at all. Because she lived for love, she lived to serve. The house was absolutely shining from top to bottom. Everything, every handkerchief was beautifully ironed and folded. Every surface shone. She was an artist in her housework, as Dad was an artist with his painting. She couldn't do bad work. She knitted all our family woolies. Everything was mended and darned. It's beautifully sewn. Modesty was her character. Do you know, I don't think, I've often thought about this. I've met a lot of people who talk a lot about God and read all the latest books and met all the latest gurus and know everything about everything. I've never been very impressed with those sort of people. But I don't know anybody in my entire life who I think was closer to God than my mother. No, I seriously say that in all seriousness, my dears. Humility counts for more than all the cleverness of this world. And Mum wasn't a church girl. She didn't talk about God. Didn't need to. She loved the birds in her garden. Just before she died, there was a duck that nested in our garden. The river flows just across the road. The ducks would come and nest in the garden. And she was lying on a bed where she died, just looking out the window downstairs. And the mother duck, she'd hatched her ducklings. And if you know what ducks do, after the ducklings are hatched, they walk them from the nest, wherever that is, down to the water. Well, to do that, she had to walk across our lawn, across our garden. And Mother saw that. And, she said a very interesting thing. She said, "That's my religion," she said. "Fresh life, clean and pure." They are, my dears, especially the clever ones. I go along with that too. And my God, I think of those old Russian ladies. They talk of holy Russia, holy Mother Russia. It's the mother, always the mother, not the man. The mother. Russia is considered a feminine country. They talk of the motherland, not the fatherland. Yes, the Mother Russia. God, I've seen more holiness in the faces of old people in Russia. Just some decrepit little old woman in the bus clutching her bundles of potatoes. You see it, my dears. You see it. Complete absence of ego. Just not there at all.
You write, Orthodox services brought me into a fresh appreciation of the church. People are rediscovering the beauty of churches, or they might have the desire to a spiritual path, but there is a disconnect with the church.
Yes, yes, this is very interesting. It's I was pretty much this way myself. I had 10 years of compulsory religion and scripture lessons at school. So I'm well taught in all that. Like many young men, when I left school, I went east. I read what I could of Eastern religions and learned to meditate, and pretty much stayed with that, with only a sort of toehold in the church. Actually, I was so lit up when I first started to meditate, because I felt this was exactly what the church was missing. I felt this was spirituality made practical. And I went straight off to our local bishop, full of enthusiasm for this new practice, and wanted to become a priest. I wanted to share this with the church, but they wouldn't have me. And I made, I think, 3 attempts at some year intervals to reapply, to be accepted into the priesthood. But on being questioned, they wouldn't have me. And finally, I was told, "You're not sufficiently Christian." Well, that was quite a blow to my assessment of myself. But anyway, after I got over my upset, I sort of think, well, maybe that's a blessing in disguise. And anyway, I don't know. But anyway, I went to I suppose it wasn't so many years after that I went to Russia, and there I very soon realized that the Russian church is quite different to our normal church in Eastern England, and well, I mean, I remember the very first church I went to my amazement, right there in the middle of the congregation were a couple of open coffins with the corpse there. And of course, children were milling around, peeping into the corpse. And I thought, good heavens, well, that's calling a spade, isn't it? We don't do that in the West. What a marvelous lesson, isn't it? If anybody doubts the destiny of man, there's nothing better than to look at a corpse. So, but anyway, Orthodoxy has a number of other things it does, rather different from Western churches. Anyway, as soon as I was able to read Russian, I began to study some of the old church books. And incidentally, Orthodoxy, they still use what's called Old Church Slavonic, which is not like ordinary modern Russian spoken languages. It's the classic sort of traditional language, church language. And it took me ages to figure that out. But anyway, eventually I learned enough to be able to read it a bit. And it's very interesting. Instead of, you see, religion being sort of simplified and modified, coming down to the lowest common denominator, you see, Orthodoxy expects people to lift themselves up to religion, you see, make an effort. Now, this is a marvelous thing, because you see, if religion is made too common and almost vulgarized in the to sort of try to bring in the numbers, the quality gets scattered. It's much better to get people to work for it, to make an effort, you see. Then people will value it more. Anyway, as soon as I began to read this old church Slavonic and read these simple books, I began to realize many things about the Russian religion. Its emphasis on sin, it uses very many examples of the saints, which are ever such interesting demonstrations of how to apply faith to everyday life. There's almost no human circumstance that doesn't have a saint to show us the way of dealing with it. Yes, it's much stricter than we're used to in the West. The priest it's an authoritative religion. It doesn't have discussion groups. No, you're told. But like communism, you don't have discussions about communism. You're told. You do this, not what you think. No votes. You do what you're told. Yes, but So I began to rediscover the Christian faith from another perspective. And this really helped me very, very much indeed, because it seemed so much more serious than what I'd been accustomed to in England. It mattered, especially this question of sin, you see. And the ego, it was right at the heart of what sin is, and Orthodoxy doesn't half recognize that, and the ego is put down at every available opportunity, you see. There's in every single Orthodox service, everyone from the patriarch, that's the man at the top, to the most humble server in the church, says, I am the first of sinners. Now then, the sin, remember, is turning away from the light. If you look towards the light, you're in light. If you turn away, you're in darkness. This is what sin is. And we're all guilty of this. And so we tend to look at the world through a shadow, through the eyes of darkness. So we see bad in the world. Turn back to God and you see light. And what dispels the darkness? Well, the light does, doesn't it? More light, less dark. That's why in any society, really, an understanding of this, well, it puts you on the right foot. So I'm very deeply indebted to Russia and what I learned there, and nothing more so than this rediscovery of faith, real faith. I remember there was a well-known English sort of public figure, used to be on the radio a lot in the old days, called Malcolm Muggeridge. I went to meet him, and he was just back from a visit to Kiev, which was then part of Russia. He described the Russians throwing themselves at God. My God, that's absolutely right. That's what I do myself, always have done. That's my nature. I'm not a calculating sort of man. Throw myself into the arms of God. That's how I approach it, my dears. That's how Russians do it. Throw themselves at God. They throw themselves at communism. They throw themselves at all damn foolery. If their leaders are like that, they go crazy. But at their best, they're sublime. Love is blind, but wonderful.